You know, usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, whether it's a medical issue or an engineering flaw, there's this like baseline expectation of precision.
Right. Yeah, it's binary.
Yeah, exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the film, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. It's undeniable.
It's visible. You have a problem, you have physical evidence of the problem, and you can just draw a perfectly straight line between the cause and the effect.
Right.
It's incredibly comforting because we, as humans, we like things to be easily categorized. We like them laid out in plain sight.
But then you step into the world of alternative history, secret societies, and these massive global intelligence narratives, which is exactly what we are doing today in this deep dive.
Yeah, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely hopelessly broken.
Totally. We aren't looking at a clean fracture anymore. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
No, absolutely.
It requires looking at the shadows just as much as the light and, trying to decipher whether a shadow is just a shadow or if it's the outline of something massive.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, the massive stack of sources we're looking at today, they do not rely on clean lines or official government press releases.
Definitely not.
Instead, these investigators and authors, they rely on deciphering this incredibly complex web of symbols, historical echoes, architectural anomalies, and just deep systemic connections that most people walk right past every single day.
Right, without a second thought. And we are thrilled you're here with us as we try to make sense of it all. Today, we are looking at a truly massive, highly controversial, and incredibly dense stack of sources.
It's a lot to get through.
It really is. We've got alternative historical analyses, deep esoteric symbol breakdowns, independent investigative claims, leaked audio files, the works.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to impartially unpack the sweeping, labyrinthine, alternative narrative presented in these documents. We basically want to understand exactly how the authors of these texts view the world.
And we need to be very, very clear right up front about what we are doing here.
Yes.
The sources we are diving into make some monumental claims. They claim that the institutions we think we know, governments, intelligence agencies, and specifically the Vatican, are actually fronts.
Right.
They argue these entities are masking ancient secret societies that are operating a unified, often ruthless global agenda.
Exactly. And before we go a single step further, we have to issue a very explicit disclaimer on impartiality.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Our job here is strictly to act as your guides through this material. We are not endorsing, we are not validating, and we are absolutely not taking any political or religious sides on these claims.
Right, we're just laying it out.
Exactly. Some of this material is heavily politically charged. It touches on prominent left-wing and right-wing figures, and it dives into deeply sensitive religious topics.
Very sensitive.
So we are impartially reporting on the content provided in our source stack. We want to allow you, the listener, to understand the architecture of the worldview these authors have constructed, exactly as they present it.
We are cartographers today.
Yeah.
We are mapping the territory of this theory. We are not defending the territory.
I like that.
Because to understand how millions of people are currently interpreting world events, you really have to understand the foundational texts, the historical grievances, and the specific claims they're building their entire worldview upon.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the journey we are going on today is wild.
It really is.
We are going to trace a conceptual line from ancient Babylonian sun worship right up to the modern architecture of the Vatican.
Yeah.
We're going to explore the hidden systemic connections the authors draw between the JFK assassination in 1963 and the recent, highly controversial death of conservative activist Charlie Kirk.
The parallels they draw there are fascinating.
They really are. And ultimately, we are going to decode the secret, alleged meaning behind the specific jewelry worn by his widow, Erica Kirk.
It's a massive puzzle. And to even begin to navigate it, we have to start at the very top of the power structure. Well, at least as is defined by these sources.
Right.
Before we can even touch on modern political assassinations or, esoteric symbols on a widow's hand, we have to understand who these authors claim is actually pulling the strings.
So let's start with the Vatican, because the core information presented across multiple texts in our stack alleges something that would completely shock the average person walking down the street.
Well, absolutely.
The sources claim that the Vatican, the Pope, the Holy See, the Roman Catholic Church, and its various operational arms, so the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, the Knights of Columbus, the bishops, are not actually Christian entities at all.
That is the absolute foundational premise of this entire worldview. The text described the entire apparatus of the Vatican as an ancient Babylonian pagan cult.
A Babylonian pagan cult. I mean, wow.
Yeah. They argue it is a system fundamentally based on the worship of the sun, fertility deities, and in some of the more esoteric and fundamentalist sources we reviewed, Lucifer himself.
Well, wait, let me play devil's advocate here, because this is where I really struggled with the material initially.
Sure.
The Catholic Church has spent 2 millennia writing exhaustive, deeply complex theological doctrines centered entirely on Jesus Christ.
They have libraries full of Christian theology.
Exactly. So how do these sources explain away thousands of years of Christian doctrine as just a disguise? How do they supposedly operate in plain sight as the largest Christian denomination in the world?
That is the crucial question, and the authors explain this through the concept of exoteric versus esoteric knowledge.
Okay, break that down for us.
Exoteric means the outward-facing doctrine, so the stories, the liturgy, the charity work meant for the masses.
Right, the public faith.
Exactly. The sources argue that the Christian language is merely the exoteric shell. But the esoteric layer, the hidden, true meaning, meant only for the highly initiated elites within the hierarchy, is purely Babylonian.
Oh, wow.
And what's fascinating here is how the sources prove this to themselves. They don't look at the public sermons. They look at the physical architecture and the deeply embedded symbols.
Right, because words can lie, but the authors believe symbols are like a binding contract.
Yes, perfectly put.
Let's look at the architecture they point to. Our sources spent a massive amount of time analyzing St. Peter's Square at the Vatican.
They really do.
To a tourist, it's just a beautiful historic plaza, but the texts point out the massive 85-foot-tall Egyptian obelisk sitting dead center in the square.
Which is an incredible thing to consider when you adopt their lens. I mean, why would the center of global Christianity feature a monument from ancient Egypt? In ancient pagan traditions, the obelisk is unequivocally a phallic symbol representing the sun god, Osiris. The sources argue that placing it there isn't just an appreciation of antiquities. It is a declaration of spiritual allegiance.
And it's not just an obelisk sitting on a lawn either. It's positioned inside a massive geometric circle.
Exactly. The sources draw heavily from historical Masonic authors like Albert Pike and conspiracy researchers like Tex Mars to explain the geometry here.
Right.
A point within a circle is a classic Druidic, Masonic, and ancient pagan symbol. It represents the sun deity, but it also represents the female generative power.
Okay.
So when you put the phallic obelisk inside the circular plaza, the authors argue you have constructed a massive, undeniable pagan fertility symbol right in the administrative headquarters of the Catholic Church.
That is wild. The sources, like the video transcript from Christians Keeping It 100, they also specifically call out the widespread use of dragon crests displayed on the papal coat of arms by various popes over the centuries.
Yeah, the dragons are a big focus.
Right. To the layman, a dragon is just a cool medieval heraldry beast. But the authors argue this is clear evidence of worshiping other gods.
Because of the biblical connection.
Exactly. They directly connect the dragon to the biblical imagery in the Book of Revelation, which they interpret as the ultimate symbol of pagan sun worship and satanic authority. They argue the Vatican is practicing a secondhand Christianity that is masking a much older, darker religion.
And this is where we have to transition from the ancient theology to modern geopolitics. Because the sources claim this Babylonian continuation isn't just about preserving old myths.
Right. It's not just a history club.
No, it has a very modern, very aggressive geopolitical goal. They allege that the Vatican's ultimate objective is a new world order, basically total global domination.
The geopolitical claims in the stack are staggering. We have excerpts from Avram Manhattan's historical work, which literally outlines what he calls a Vatican-Moscow-Washington alliance.
Yeah, Avram Manhattan goes deep into this.
The claim is that the Vatican shouldn't be viewed as a church, but as a sovereign superpower, on par with the United States and Russia.
Right.
But unlike the US or Russia, it operates completely without borders, influencing hundreds of millions of people globally through its bishops and priests.
The texts claim the Vatican has historically orchestrated major world conflicts to maintain and consolidate this power. They point to World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, arguing the Vatican essentially plays all sides.
Wow, all sides.
Yeah. Avram Manhattan's text claims the Vatican historically supported fascism as a ruthless bulwark against communism. They signed official concordats with Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy to protect their institutional power. completely regardless of the human cost.
Which brings us to one of the most tragic and haunting pieces of evidence the sources use to highlight the Vatican's alleged complicity with totalitarian regimes. It's the story of Edith Stein.
Such a sad story.
This is detailed in the investigative journal audio source we reviewed, and it is incredibly heavy. Edith Stein was a brilliant Jewish philosopher who converted to Catholicism and actually became a Carmelite nun.
Yes. In 1933, as the Nazis were seizing power in Germany and beginning their systematic persecution of the Jews, Sister Edith Stein saw exactly what was happening.
Right.
So she wrote a desperate, impassioned letter directly to the Pope.
The sources provide the translated text of her letter. She writes, "I dare to speak to the father of Christianity about that which oppresses millions of Germans." She practically begs the church to raise its voice.
Yeah.
She points out the painful irony that the government perpetrating these horrors was publicly calling itself Christian. She asks the Pope, "Is not all of this diametrically opposed to the conduct of our Lord and Savior?"
And according to the historical record presented in the sources, the response from the Vatican was absolute silence.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. Stein's letter received no answer. The Vatican did not publicly condemn the regime at that critical juncture. In 1942, as the war raged, Sister Edith Stein was arrested by the Gestapo at a convent in the Netherlands.
Oh, man.
Later that same year, she was murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. The sources make a point to note that the Vatican didn't even publicly release the contents of her 1933 letter until 2003.
That is just, it's heartbreaking. The authors of our sources use this story to argue a much larger point. They argue that the Vatican is not just passively complicit in global tragedies, but actively willing to sacrifice its own devoted followers if speaking out goes against their geopolitical temporal strategy.
Exactly.
The host of that audio source asks a rhetorical question. He says, "Does this tell you anything about the Vatican's connection to the Nazi regime?" He argues it speaks volumes about a deep structural ruthlessness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture the sources are painting, they view the Vatican as an entirely pragmatic, Machiavellian political entity draped in religious garb. They argue that the Church uses the exoteric spiritual authority it holds over the masses to mask an esoteric, earthly hunger for total power.
I want to try an analogy here, because wrapping my head around how all these disparate groups supposedly work together was tough.
Go for it.
It almost sounds like the authors are describing a massive global corporate conglomerate.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Picture a parent company that operates under dozens of different, completely unrelated shell companies. You've got the Freemasons, the Jesuits, the Illuminati, the Knights of Malta, various intelligence agencies.
Right.
Outwardly, they might even seem to compete in the marketplace. They might have entirely different branding and target audiences. But according to this theory, if you follow the money and the power all the way up, they all report to the exact same board of directors.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. And it is precisely how the sources frame the architecture of this shadow government.
Okay, good.
And your corporate conglomerate analogy perfectly explains what seems like a massive contradiction to any casual historian. For example, the Vatican has historically and very publicly condemned Freemasonry.
Right. There are papal bulls forbidding Catholics from becoming Masons.
Yes. Yet the sources like the voluminous writings of Eric John Phelps and Avro Manhattan insist that at the highest levels, they are completely interlinked.
Okay, they claim that high-level Freemasonry and the Vatican's inner circle are basically working hand in hand. So how do they square that circle? Because those two things seem totally at odds.
The theory posits that the public feuds are merely theater for the masses. It's the illusion of choice and the illusion of opposition.
Just the show.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the lower ranks, at the local lodge or the local parish, a Catholic and a Freemason might genuinely believe their organizations are opposed. But the authors argue that when you reach the 33rd degree of Scottish Rite Masonry, and when you reach the highest esoteric levels of the Jesuit order, the belief systems merge.
Wow.
At the top of the pyramid, it becomes a shared Gnostic enlightenment.
For those who might not spend their weekends reading ancient theology, what exactly is Gnostic enlightenment in this specific context?
In this context, Gnosticism is the belief that salvation or ultimate power comes from secret, hidden knowledge. Knowledge that the uninitiated masses are too ignorant to handle.
Okay, so it's very elitist.
Highly elitist. The sources argue this top-tier knowledge is a Luciferian worldview, where Lucifer is viewed not as the devil, but as the true bringer of light and intellect. This knowledge is strictly reserved for the elite board of directors, as you call them, while the masses are controlled through the exoteric, rule-based public religions.
Okay, so we have established this incredibly complex, alleged invisible architecture of global power, a Babylonian corporate conglomerate masking itself as a church.
Correct.
But that begs the obvious question. What happens when someone inside the system, someone with actual, tangible executive power, goes off script? What happens when a world leader decides they don't want to play along with the Vatican's board of directors?
According to our sources, we don't have to guess. They claim that is exactly what happened in the early 1960s, and the brutal retaliation for that rebellion became the ultimate historical blueprint for how the shadow government systemically eliminates existential threats.
We are talking about November 22, 1963, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas.
Yes.
Now, this is where the sources take a massive leap into alternative history, and honestly, it seems counterintuitive at first glance. JFK was famously the first Roman Catholic president of the United States.
He was.
You would think, according to this narrative, that the Vatican would be thrilled. He should be their star employee.
You absolutely would think that. But the sources, particularly the exhaustive excerpts we reviewed from Vatican Assassins by Eric John Phelps, claim that Kennedy actually rebelled against the Vatican's temporal power.
Let's unpack that term. What exactly is temporal power?
Temporal power refers to earthly, political, and material power as opposed to spiritual authority. The authors argue that the Vatican believes it has the divine right to rule all earthly governments. Kennedy, according to the texts, believed in the separation of church and state. He refused to be a puppet.
Wow.
Because he pushed back, he became, in the eyes of Rome's canon law, as interpreted by these authors, a usurper and a tyrant.
And the sources don't just speak in generalities. They list specific major policy grievances. They claim Kennedy tried to end the Cold War and pull troops out of the escalating Vietnam War.
Which is a huge deal.
Right. Now, mainstream history views Vietnam as a complex geopolitical disaster, but our sources frame the Vietnam War specifically as a Jesuit-run conflict designed intentionally for war profiteering, drug running, and consolidating control in Southeast Asia.
Exactly. So, by trying to stop it, Kennedy was cutting off a major operation.
Furthermore, they claim he recognized the corruption within the intelligence community and wanted to dismantle the CIA. Famously, he allegedly pledged to splinter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds.
Yeah. And to the authors, the CIA is essentially the intelligence wing of the Knights of Malta and the Jesuits.
But perhaps most significantly, especially in terms of raw financial control, the sources point to Executive Order 11-110.
This is a major point in the text.
They claim Kennedy tried to bypass the privately owned Federal Reserve by issuing interest-free United States notes backed by actual silver reserves. If successful, this would essentially cut the international bankers who the sources link directly to Vatican wealth management completely out of the loop.
Because he dared to touch the war machine, the intelligence apparatus, and the money supply, the sources allege a hit was ordered. And they don't blame some rogue elements or the mafia.
Who do they blame?
They point the finger directly at the absolute top of the American Catholic hierarchy at the time, Cardinal Francis Spellman, the Archbishop of New York.
The texts repeatedly refer to Spellman as the American Pope. They paint him as the ultimate power broker.
They really do.
They claim he utilized his extensive network of Knights of Malta, specifically identifying men highly placed within the CIA, like Director Alan Dulles and John A. McConey, and key figures within the FBI to orchestrate the assassination from the inside.
It's a staggering, sweeping accusation. But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly incredibly dark. The sources don't just view the assassination as a pragmatic political hit to remove a problem.
Right.
They view the manner of the assassination as an esoteric occult ritual.
This is where we get into the writings of alternative researchers like David Icke and James Shelby Downard. They frame the Dealey Plaza shooting not as a sniper ambush, but as a highly specific Masonic ritual known as the killing of the king.
Yes.
They describe it as an ancient fertility oblation, a blood sacrifice.
And to prove this, they break down the geography, the math, and the symbolic synchronicities, and the connections they draw are incredibly intricate. Let's look at the physical location. Dealey Plaza. The sources point out that architecturally, from above, the plaza is shaped exactly like a truncated pyramid, a pyramid with the capstone missing.
Which is a classic Illuminati and Masonic symbol. It's the exact same symbol you see on the back of the U.S. $1 bill.
Exactly.
The authors argue you don't perform a ritual sacrifice just anywhere. You do it in a prepared temple. The plaza itself is named after George Bannerman Dealey, and the text makes sure to identify him as a 33rd degree Freemason.
Furthermore, the sources heavily emphasize the latitudinal location. Dallas, Texas is located very close to the 33rd parallel north.
Right, and the 33rd degree, of course, being the highest, most illuminated level of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And the ritualistic elements go even deeper into the mechanics of the shooting itself.
How so?
Well, the sources claim JFK wasn't just shot from the Texas school book depository by a lone gunman. They claim he was intentionally shot from multiple angles in a crossfire.
Why would they need multiple angles symbolically?
To explicitly mimic the foundational Masonic legend of Hiram Abiff.
Hiram Abiff is a central allegorical figure in Freemasonry, the master builder of King Solomon's temple, who was struck down by 3 assassins because he refused to give up the secret passwords. The sources argue the crossfire was a physical reenactment of this legend.
The sources we reviewed, specifically drawing from researchers like Robert Groden and Howard Donahue, allege a massive systemic cover-up of the ballistics.
They certainly do.
They claim the fatal headshot absolutely did not come from behind. And incredibly, some of the texts claim the fatal shot was fired at point-blank range by the driver of the presidential limousine, Secret Service agent William Greer, while another simultaneous shot came from a completely different angle inside a storm drain.
Now, you're probably listening to this and thinking, how do hundreds of people keep a public multi-shooter execution in broad daylight quiet?
Right, it sounds impossible.
But the authors insist that the public nature of the execution wasn't a flaw, it was the entire point. Doing it in broad daylight, in an outdoor sun temple, as they call it, Dealey Plaza, was entirely intentional. It wasn't meant to be quiet. It was meant to be a visceral, undeniable, traumatic warning to any other world leader who might ever think about defying the board of directors.
And the sources love to point out the mathematical and symbolic synchronicities to prove that this wasn't random, but heavily, heavily scripted. Let's look at the coincidences with the Lincoln assassination detailed in the revisionist history source.
Oh, this part is wild.
It is mind-bending how much weight the authors put on these repeating numbers.
They argue that both Lincoln and Kennedy were assassinated by this exact same shadow network for the exact same reason.
They both tried to issue interest-free currency. Lincoln issued the greenbacks, Kennedy issued the United States notes.
But the mathematical coincidences the sources list to prove the script. Okay, listen to this. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy in 1960. Both were succeeded by Southern Democrats named Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908.
Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was born in 1839. Kennedy's alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was born in 1939.
It just keeps going.
Both presidents were shot in the head. Both were shot on a Friday. Both were shot in the presence of their wives. Lincoln was shot in Ford's theater. Kennedy was shot while riding in a Lincoln automobile manufactured by Ford.
It's a dizzying list. The sources use this incredible repetition of names, dates, and numbers to argue that these events are not history playing out organically. They believe the Brotherhood or the Illuminati are fundamentally obsessed with numerology and symbolic echoes.
Right.
To them, these synchronicities are the director's signature on the script.
It fundamentally forces you to ask, how much of history is just random chance, the chaotic collision of millions of human decisions, and how much of it is a script being acted out by hidden directors?
This raises an important point for you, the listener, to consider. Think about how looking at history through this specific lens of intentional occult ritual entirely changes one's perception of random national tragedies.
Oh, absolutely.
If these sources are right, nothing is an accident. Every major political assassination is a carefully crafted message encoded in symbols delivered by a network that has been operating flawlessly for centuries.
And according to our source stack, we don't have to look back to the 1960s to see this network in action. The authors argue that exact blueprint of systemic elimination, that exact scripted ritual, was just used again in the modern day.
Which brings us to the transition from the grainy Zapruder film era to the high-definition digital age. We're going to look at the death of conservative activist Charlie Kirk.
Right. Now, officially, the circumstances surrounding his death have been widely debated in the public sphere, but the provided sources explicitly and unequivocally characterize it as a state-sponsored assassination.
Yes, they don't mince words.
They claim it was a highly coordinated operation designed to orchestrate a massive, terrifying societal shift.
The sources explicitly compare the deaths of JFK and Charlie Kirk. On the surface, they are very different men in very different eras. But the texts argue both were highly influential figures capable of mobilizing massive amounts of people outside of traditional establishment channels.
Right, populist figures.
Exactly. And the texts claim both were ultimately removed by the system because they had outlived their usefulness or were becoming too difficult to control.
But the Charlie Kirk narrative in these sources gets incredibly complex. It blends modern political conspiracy theories with intense 19th century religious prophecy.
It's a very unique blend.
Some of the sources we looked at, like the videos from Amazing Word Ministries, even float the idea that the event was a completely staged crisis. They throw out theories that a hologram was used or that the entire thing was a massive psychological operation utilizing crisis actors.
But what's crucial to understand is that the mechanics of his actual death are almost secondary to the authors. What they care deeply about is the fallout of the death.
Okay, so what happens next?
Right. The texts argue that Charlie Kirk's death was specifically designed to empower a very specific demographic, Christian nationalists.
Okay, let's stop and unpack this, because this is where I really struggled to follow the author's logic. It feels like a massive leap.
It does seem like one, yeah.
Why would this shadow network, which we just established in the first half of this deep dive, is supposedly a Babylonian pagan cult running the Vatican, why on earth would they want to empower conservative Christian nationalists in America? Wouldn't those groups be completely opposed?
It does seem contradictory until you look at it through the lens of Protestant eschatology.
Eschatology meaning the theological study of the end of the world.
Correct. The sources claim that this staged assassination is being used as a catalyst, using the Hegelian dialectic.
Problem, reaction, solution.
Exactly. Create the chaotic crisis, the assassination of a beloved figure. Fund the reaction, incite a religious fervor among Christian nationalists demanding moral order and retribution,
Right.
and then provide the solution. The ultimate goal, the sources allege, is to create a cultural crisis so severe that the state is forced to merge with the church to maintain order, leading to the enforcement of national Sunday worship laws.
Sunday worship laws, that seems like such a specific, almost archaic goal for a global shadow government. Why do they care what day people go to church?
To these specific authors, many of whom seem to draw from Seventh-day Adventist theology, the day of worship is the ultimate mark of authority. They argue that historically, the papacy changed the biblical day of rest from Saturday the Sabbath to Sunday.
Okay, I see.
Therefore, Sunday worship is seen not as a biblical mandate, but as a mark of Vatican authority over the scriptures. By empowering Christian nationalists who will supposedly push for Sunday legislation to heal the nation, the Vatican is secretly achieving its ultimate goal of global religious dominance, using American evangelicals as their unwitting pawns.
And the sources specifically mention that this new religious zealotry will set the stage to legally execute Sabbath keepers, specifically identifying Seventh-day Adventists who worship on Saturday and refuse to bend to Sunday laws.
That's the endgame in this narrative. The text actually quotes Christian nationalists saying that the men who assassinated Charlie Kirk need to be publicly executed.
Wow.
And the source argues, this is what's going to happen to Sabbath keepers for breaking Sunday. They needed a crisis to start talking about things like that. It is a terrifying leap in logic, taking a political event and turning it into the spark for religious inquisition.
But you can see how the author meticulously connects the dots within their own framework.
Oh yeah, the internal logic holds up.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's really about the concept of the power vacuum. In the aftermath of JFK's death, power shifted dramatically. The Vietnam War escalated exactly as the military-industrial complex wanted. The CIA's power grew unchecked. In the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, the sources argue the power didn't disperse into the ether. It transferred directly and intentionally to a very specific, carefully chosen successor.
Right. The sources argue the power transferred directly to his widow, Erica Kirk. And they claim her sudden ascension into the political spotlight is leading to an intentional spiritual reawakening that serves the Vatican's darker agenda.
Which means we need to take a very close look at Erica Kirk herself. Because to understand the aftermath, the sources insist we cannot just view her as a mourning spouse. We must examine her origins, her education, and the network that surrounds her.
The texts are absolutely adamant that Erica Kirk is not the grieving, traditional Christian widow she portrays on television and social media.
They really push back on that image.
They allege she is a highly trained, carefully groomed intelligence operative. and the sources immediately point to her educational background as proof. She attended Regis University in Denver, Colorado.
And the texts make a massive point of highlighting in bold letters that Regis is a private Jesuit institution.
Now, tying back to everything we discussed earlier, in the worldview of these sources, Jesuit training isn't just about getting a quality Catholic education and a degree in communications.
No. In this framework, the Jesuits are the apex predators. They are the military and intelligence arm of the Vatican. They are the architects of the New World Order.
So the sources argue that by attending a Jesuit university, Erica was, quote, groomed, trained, and positioned in place not to mourn, but to inherit.
To inherit the power vacuum.
Exactly. They view her education as an initiation into the intelligence apparatus. They believe she was selected long ago to play this exact role.
And it's not just her education that they view suspiciously. The sources dig deeply into her past in the beauty pageant world. She competed in the 2012 Miss USA pageant, representing the state of Arizona.
And who owned the Miss Universe organization at that time?
Donald Trump.
The sources love tracing these closed-loop networks. They are obsessed with finding the invisible threads. They highlight what they call a gigantic coincidence.
Lay it out for us.
Look at the sequence. Charlie Kirk's father, an architect, allegedly helped build Trump Tower. Erica Kirk was a model in Trump's pageant system. Charlie Kirk grows up to become a massive political ally and operative for Donald Trump.
Right.
And Donald Trump is now central to the political fallout and the religious fervor following Charlie's assassination.
The sources frame it all as a closed fraternity. It's a big family of elites where everyone knows everyone, everyone owes someone, and absolutely nothing happens organically. It's a caste system.
The very small world, according to them.
But honestly, the weirdest part of the Erica Kirk analysis in these sources is the spiritual aspect. They focus heavily on how she's being praised online by alternative media.
The sources reference esoteric and New Age websites, like one specifically called Esoteric Compass, that praise Erica Kirk not just as a strong woman, but as the embodiment of the divine feminine.
Now, to a normal person scrolling through Instagram, saying someone embodies the divine feminine might just sound like a nice poetic compliment. You're praising her grace, her resilience under fire, her maternal strength in the face of an unimaginable national tragedy.
But our sources view it entirely differently. In the context of these texts, particularly the fundamentalist Christian sources, praising the divine feminine is an accusation of outright spiritualism and witchcraft.
Wow, witchcraft.
Yeah. They equate the divine feminine to ancient goddess worship, drawing a direct line all the way back to Isis in Egypt or Semiramis in ancient Babylon.
One of the video sources actually calls it pure demonic. They argue that positioning her as the divine feminine for America's future is part of what they call Jezebel programming.
Right, Jezebel programming.
It's a psychological operation designed to deceive the masses, especially conservative Christians who think they are supporting a traditional life, into accepting a new, unified occult religion that is merely masquerading as traditional faith.
They argue that she is acting as a vessel. She is meant to channel this esoteric energy, sparking a spiritual reawakening that is actually a trap. It's the ultimate bait and switch.
Exactly.
Present a beautiful, traditional, grieving Christian widow to the public, gain their sympathy and loyalty, but use her platform to subtly introduce New Age, esoteric, and ultimately Vatican-approved globalist theology.
It's a massive, heavy accusation. They are basically saying her entire public persona, her grief, her marriage, is a scripted psychological operation. But the sources say if you want definitive proof, you don't listen to her speeches. You don't analyze her tears. You look at her hands.
This is the crux of the entire modern narrative we're unpacking today. If you want to know someone's true allegiances in the world of these sources, you do not listen to the exoteric words coming out of their mouth. You look at their esoteric symbols.
The most hyper-focused, intensely scrutinized element of all the claims against Erica Kirk centers on her hands during her heartbreaking viral memorial speech.
Yeah, the internet went crazy over this.
This was the moment where she publicly forgave her husband's killer. It was a moment of profound Christian grace. But the internet investigators completely ignored the message of forgiveness and zeroed in on her jewelry, specifically her rings.
The sources provide extreme, zoomed-in close-ups of the rings she was wearing on stage. The most prominent piece is a large gold ring bearing a very distinct, stylized letter G.
Right.
Now, when this went viral, mainstream fact-checkers quickly jumped in to debunk the conspiracy theories. They suggested the G obviously stands for God, fitting the theme of her speech, or perhaps it stands for her daughter's name, Gigi.
But the authors of our texts are absolutely adamant, and they openly mock the fact-checkers. To them, the G stands for exactly what it stands for when it is placed perfectly in the center of the Freemasonic square and compass logo.
To a Freemason, the G traditionally stands for God, or the great architect of the universe, and geometry. Geometry is the mathematical science upon which the architectural fraternity is founded, but esoterically, it represents the building of the internal spiritual temple.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, our conspiracy sources interpret it further. They argue the G stands for Gnosticism, that hidden Luciferian knowledge we discussed earlier.
And the sources claim it's not just the presence of the G that proves their point. They point to the hidden, intricate details on the sides of the ring itself.
Yes, the side profile is key for them.
They allege that if you look closely at the side profile, the ring features a pyramid and the all-seeing eye. If true, that firmly cements its nature not as a monogram, but as a piece of occult, Illuminati, or Masonic jewelry.
They also note another ring on her finger that allegedly features an M.
What does the M stand for?
Well, the texts tie this M to specific Masonic orders, or perhaps the Priory of Sion, and they argue the geometric design of the rings themselves is shaped to resemble the all-seeing eye of Horus.
Wow.
But taking a step back, it really begs a fundamental question. Why rings? If you are part of a super-secret global shadow government, why are you obsessed with wearing easily identifiable jewelry on national television?
That's exactly what I was thinking. Why broadcast it? But the philosophy of rings in these esoteric texts is deeply fascinating, and it explains their logic.
It goes back a long way.
It does. Drawing heavily from sources like Texamar's book, Codex Magica, rings are not viewed as mere decorative fashion accessories. In the occult worldview, rings are considered powerful, magical talismans.
Right. They trace the mythology of the ring all the way back to antiquity, specifically to King Solomon. According to ancient esoteric legends, Solomon possessed a magic ring engraved with a hexagram, known as the Seal of Solomon.
Okay.
He supposedly used the power of this ring to command, bind, and enslave demons to help him construct the first temple in Jerusalem.
So the ring is fundamentally an instrument of binding and control. The texts also look at European history. Historically, among the ancient Celts, a woman giving a ring to a man wasn't just a romantic gesture. It symbolized sexual availability and physical binding. Rings were used in Anglo-Saxon England to bind chieftains to their warriors. A ring represents an unbreakable covenant.
So when we apply that to the context of Freemasonry and secret societies, what does the ring mean to the person actually wearing it?
Right, what's the purpose for them?
To the initiate, a Masonic ring is considered a crown of purity. It is a badge of honor that shows they have achieved a certain high level of enlightenment, they have learned the secrets, and they are now eternally bound by the mystic tie of the fraternity.
But of course, to the authors of our sources, these rings are the exact opposite of purity. To them, these rings are a physical sign of absolute fidelity to Lucifer.
Yes, exactly.
They are a brand, they are a physical marker demonstrating that the wearer has fully submitted to the authority of the secret society and the Vatican's agenda.
And the sources make sure to point out that Erica Kirk is far from the only member of the elite wearing these broadcast signals. They list several other examples of prominent figures wearing highly specific, esoteric jewelry to prove this is a widespread, systemic practice.
Oh, yeah. They mention Arnold Schwarzenegger, detailing instances where he is wearing a massive blue sapphire Masonic ring, prominently displayed in high-resolution photographs.
Right.
They mention Hillary Clinton wearing a very specific phoenix rising brooch. The phoenix, of course, being a major occult and Masonic symbol representing rebirth from the ashes, which the authors interpret as the birth of the New World Order out of the planned chaos of the Old World.
They even go into the minutiae of lapel pins, specifically mentioning a pin worn by Masons shaped like a golf club or a hockey stick with two balls attached.
The Tubal-Cain pin. Tubal-Cain is a biblical figure, the first forger of metals, and his name is used as the secret password of a master mason. But the texts argue the visual shape of the pin represents the male generative principle, the phallus,
which directly links modern suit-and-tie masonry back to the ancient Babylonian pagan fertility cults we talked about with the obelisk.
Exactly. So the analogy here is vital to understand their worldview. Wearing these rings or lapel pins is exactly like a gang member wearing their street gang's colors or a die-hard fan wearing a sports team's jersey.
Yeah, it's about signaling.
But it's operating on a much higher, more sophisticated level. It's a silent, undeniable broadcast to all the other initiates in the room.
Exactly. It bypasses the political theater entirely. It tells everyone who knows how to read the visual code exactly who you really work for, regardless of what political party you claim to belong to on television.
Right.
You could be a staunch Democrat or a fiery Republican on CNN, but if you're wearing the ring, the other initiates know you both report to the same board of directors.
The sources argue that when Erica Kirk stood on that memorial stage, presenting herself to the world as the weeping, mourning Christian widow, she was simultaneously broadcasting a completely different message to the elite network.
Yes.
She was signaling that she is fully initiated, she is bound by the covenant of the ring, and she is ready to play her part in the next phase of the agenda.
And if these rings truly symbolize membership in this ruthless, global Vatican Masonic elite, what exactly does this group do behind closed doors?
Because if you thought the geopolitical assassinations and the destruction of the Republic were dark, the sources take a horrific stomach-turning turn here.
This brings us to the dark underbelly of the entire theory. The texts don't just accuse Erica Kirk of being a political operative or a religious deceiver. They accuse her of actively operating a child trafficking front.
It's a huge claim.
It is. And it links her directly to a much broader, horrifying global network of elite abuse.
Let's look at the specific claims leveled against her NGO. According to her public biography, she started a charity organization called Everyday Heroes, which featured a specific project called Romanian Angels.
Right.
On paper, the exoteric story is that they partnered with the U.S. military to provide aid and help orphans in Romania. It sounds incredibly noble.
But the leaked files and the intense accusations cited in the sources tell a completely different, deeply sinister story. They allege that her charity, operating out of Constanta, Romania, a port city that the texts label as a notorious historical hub for international human trafficking, was actually a front.
Wow.
They claim the NGO was funneling vulnerable young orphans to private islands and directly into the hands of intelligence groups like the Mossad.
The sources claim that local Romanian workers reported that the kids weren't being protected, they were actively being taken and disappearing. And the investigators point out the extreme logistical improbability of the official story.
They have a good point there.
They ask, how does a 17-year-old girl, which Erica was at the time, successfully set up a massive international NGO, secure funding, and partner directly with the United States military in a foreign country without high-level intelligence backing and grooming? They argue it's impossible unless she was an operative.
And if we zoom out from Erica Kirk specifically, the expert sources in our stack connect this specific accusation to a vast historical pattern of institutional systemic abuse. They don't see it as an isolated incident. They bring up the infamous case of Emanuela Orlandi.
Yes, the 15-year-old girl who vanished into thin air in Rome in 1983.
Exactly. But the crucial, horrifying detail is that Emanuela Orlandi was a citizen of Vatican City. Her family lived inside the Vatican walls. Her father worked for the papal household.
Oh, wow.
The sources, such as Johnny Cerrucci's book, Eaters of Children, allege she wasn't grabbed by random criminals. They claim she was specifically targeted and kidnapped from within to be used for elite blackmail, trafficking, and psychological control within the highest echelons of the Vatican hierarchy.
The sources also draw thick, dark lines connecting all of this to the Jeffrey Epstein network. They note Epstein's alleged, well-documented ties to international intelligence agencies, the Mossad, and they even cite claims that Epstein and his associates had private meetings with Pope John Paul II.
It's all connected in their eyes.
The authors use this to suggest that the blackmail network isn't just a few bad actors. It is a unified system that reaches the absolute highest levels of global financial and religious power.
And perhaps the most disturbing graphic source in the entire stack is an audio testimony of a woman claiming to be a survivor of a black-budget, CIA-run operation located in Central Texas.
She refers to the facility as Uncle Sam's Snuff Factory.
The testimony describes deep, subterranean military bases where unimaginable mass atrocities and child trafficking are committed. But they aren't just committed. They are filmed, cataloged, and sold on the black market to wealthy, depraved elites. She explicitly ties the operation of this facility to organized crime families working hand-in-hand with the CIA and military intelligence.
It is incredibly difficult material to even speak about, let alone process. It's sickening. But I want to try to understand the why. What is the strategic purpose of this darkness, according to the texts? Why would a global superpower risk everything to run these rings?
That is the underlying unifying theory of all these texts. It's about leverage. These horrific acts of abuse and trafficking aren't just crimes committed by sociopaths for pleasure. They are systemic, carefully engineered mechanisms of control.
Leverage, so they can control the people at the top.
Exactly. The elites who wear the Masonic rings, who run the intelligence agencies, and who operate out of the Vatican use the video evidence of this horrific blackmail to ensure absolute, unbreakable loyalty from politicians, judges, and CEOs. You can't break rank if they have you on tape.
It's the ultimate insurance policy.
Yes. And furthermore, the esoteric magical sources we read argue an even darker point. They argue that these horrific acts of trauma and sacrifice actually provide raw, ritualistic power to the elites, feeding the dark Babylonian spiritual entities they supposedly worship. It is a complete fusion of pragmatic political blackmail and ancient occult blood magic.
Okay, let's take a deep breath, because we have just taken you, the listener, on an incredible, labyrinthine, and truly overwhelming journey through the minds of these investigators.
We have mapped out a worldview that is staggeringly complex, paranoid, and highly intricate.
Let's recap the architecture we just explored. We started with the massive claim that the Vatican is not the seat of global Christianity, but a brilliantly disguised continuation of a Babylonian pagan cult worshipping the sun and Osiris right in St. Peter's Square.
Right.
We walked through the theory that this Vatican Masonic corporate alliance utilizes intelligence agencies to execute systemic assassinations against anyone who threatens their temporal power and their money. We looked at how they view the esoteric, ritualistic, mathematically precise murder of JFK as the ultimate historical blueprint for these hits.
We then watched how the authors applied that exact 1963 blueprint to the modern day, examining the claims that Charlie Kirk's death was a staged assassination. We explored the complex Protestant eschatology that suggests his death was designed to empower Christian nationalists, merge church and state, and ultimately enforce Vatican Sunday law.
We looked at how his widow, Erica Kirk, supposedly groomed by Jesuit universities and embedded in Trump's pageant fraternity, stepped into the power vacuum, hailed as the divine feminine. And we spent a lot of time decoding the esoteric Masonic rings on her fingers, the G, the pyramid, the all-seeing eye.
Those rings are central to the whole thing.
They are. Rings that the sources claim are undeniable broadcast signals masking a dark, systemic underworld of intelligence-run child trafficking in Romania and beyond.
It is a worldview where absolutely nothing is as it seems, where every coincidence is a calculation and everything is connected by invisible, unbreakable threads of power, blackmail, and ancient symbolism.
So, to you, the listener, how does it feel to view the world through this highly symbolic, hyper-connected lens? A world where a simple gold G ring on a grieving widow's finger isn't a touching reminder of her daughter or her god, but is actually interpreted as a magical talisman and a decoder ring for a global, centuries-old Luciferian conspiracy.
It's deeply disorienting to look at the world this way. But even if you completely dismiss every single claim in these sources as pure fiction, as rampant paranoia, or as deliberate weaponized disinformation, engaging with this material forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
What's that?
We navigate a world that is completely saturated in ancient symbols, corporate logos, and political insignias. We wear them on our clothes, we put them on our buildings, we tattoo them on our bodies, and we use them to identify our tribes.
That's true.
If symbols truly have the power to shape human psychology, to subconsciously bind us to ideologies, and to direct the course of nations, as these texts forcefully suggest, what symbols are you wearing or pledging allegiance to without ever truly knowing their origins?
That is a phenomenal, slightly terrifying question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some fascinating insights into how these complex alternative narratives are meticulously constructed and believed by millions. Keep questioning, keep looking closely at the details, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.